You're listening to Mentoring Developers.
Yeah.
What are the challenges that you will have when you are building a REST service? Then you will also need to care about how the REST service is used. And some people want, software development kits, or some people want a little bit more hand-holding, but you don't agree with that.
Well, the thing is, you have, whenever you build a distributed system with a client and server, there's going to be some kind of coupling in order for the two systems to interact. The client needs to know something about the server. So the question is, what does it need to know about the server in order to interact? The idea, or a lot of the principles behind HTTP, are that you have a fairly loose interaction model where it's standardized with the methods of get, put, post, but they could mean slightly different things. And you have messages that come back that say, oh, by the way, this came back from that request that you just sent. And if you look at the metadata, you can find out what it is that came back from the server. So it is a fairly loosey-goosey kind of contract between the client and the server that is flexible. But in order to take advantage of that contract, you need to understand a little bit about how HTTP works. And there's a certain amount of reluctance, right? And understandably, because software developers are coming into things going, I have all this stuff to learn. What should I learn and what shouldn't I learn? And the idea of learning the guts of HTTP when there's this shiny new framework that says it will do everything for me doesn't seem all that appealing. But once you actually get to learn that HTTP protocol and how to use it and how it works, the nice thing is it kind of can be applied to other HTTP APIs that are doing different things. Like you can reuse that learning and it doesn't change. When it comes to, so in reaction to people's kind of objection to learning the details of HTTP, API vendors and API providers in an attempt to encourage people to come and use their API have said, okay, well, that's okay. We'll provide a library, and our library will just we'll do all the HTTP goop for you, and we'll just provide you with a bunch of functions that you can call. And people go, hey, this is great. I know how to call a function in my particular language, and they use it. But I said before, between client and server, there's a point of coupling. Well, you just moved that point of coupling. You're no longer coupling on HTTP, which is a protocol that hasn't changed in 15 years. You're now coupling on a procedural library that is at version 0.9.4. And 0.9.7 might have a breaking change in it. And it might also have a new feature that you need. So you have to make a decision as to whether or not you're going to upgrade your application to get that new feature and then fix all of the related stuff related to that breaking change. So you have now coupled against that library that that the API provider has provided. And there's pros and cons to it. Yes, it does provide a simpler, more familiar interface. But when I go to use another API, well, you've got to learn a whole new client library that API provider that has different conventions, and it does authentication a different way, and it uses the methods slightly differently, and it has a whole different way of building a object graph. And it's amazing how different people can build client SDKs over the top of HTTP, which is actually all consistent, so that you don't get that same reuse from one API library to another. And you also have this situation where when somebody's built that client library, they had to make all kinds of assumptions about how you wanted to deal with failure conditions. And maybe what they perceive as a failure condition that is fatal isn't a failure condition that's fatal for you. The example I always give is like with an image. Right, so you're returning a resource. If the purpose of your client is to crawl that API and find all the images that are in that system, if one of the image URLs happens to be a 404, well, it's not the end of the world. You move on to the next one. Or let's say it's an image that's displaying on a toolbar or a menu or something like that. If it's not there, okay, it's not the end of the world. Your client application still be functional. But if your client application's job is to do image processing, and the user said, please go and get this image so I can do image processing on it. If you can't find it, you can't perform the function of the client application. So client libraries are forced to make decisions about how to deal with failure conditions, and all of a sudden, you as a person building an application that uses that client library have to live with the decisions that the API provider makes. And if you're building an edge case type scenario, that library may not work for you. If you go directly against the HTTP, yeah, there's a little learning up front, but you have a lot more control, a lot more flexibility, and you can reuse that learning when you go and work with other HTTP APIs. So client libraries there's ways of doing it, and I've been working on a project which I call HappyKit. It's on GitHub, which I'm experimenting with a number of different client tooling to help build client libraries that are more flexible, that don't lock you into any particular style of using them, and can also work well with hypermedia responses, or responses that come back with links in them, so that you don't have to construct URLs, or you don't have to necessarily know in advance all of the URLs that exist in an API. So that's one of my projects that I'm working on, that kind of tooling, to try and kind of find a happy medium between not giving any API tooling at all and providing this wrapper library that fixes everything down and doesn't give any flexibility.
For show notes and transcripts, visit us at mentoringdevelopers.com.